There are some diagnostic trouble codes that we deal with on a daily basis in the shop, isn't there? Among them, the P0300 series of codes, the misfire codes. If you find yourself having a hard time chasing down the cause of these misfire concerns, well, stick around. I've got some tips and techniques that just might be of help to you in this edition of The Trainer. Tracking down the cause of a misfire can be a frustrating experience, especially if that misfire is intermittent or is not causing a completely dead hole, dead cylinder. So I have a few tips and techniques I'd like to share with you that just might help. So let's go ahead and get started. First, let's talk about what exactly is a misfire. In my mind, a misfire is any condition that allows the cylinder or cylinders to contribute less than the expected amount of push to the crankshaft. Now, what do I mean by that? If all 8 cylinders are running the way they should, they're all contributing an equal amount of power, aren't they? If a condition occurs that allows one or more cylinders to contribute even a little less than it should, then it's going to apply a little less push on that crankshaft, isn't it? And the crankshaft is actually going to momentarily slow down. May not be a huge amount, not something that you're going to see show up on the RPM gauge on the instrument panel, but it does happen. In fact, that's one of the techniques that OEMs use to monitor for misfires. They watch the crankshaft speed and look for those momentary slowdowns. Now, the threshold of when a misfire code is actually recorded by the ECM varies from manufacturer to manufacturer. So you can have an engine misfire that you can feel in the seat of your pants, but it not cause the check engine light to come on or a misfire code to be set. We've all had that experience. Now, how do we identify the cylinders that are misfiring? Well, if we do have a check engine light on, hopefully we won't have just a plain old P0300, the random misfire code, but we'll have a cylinder-specific DTC that we can use as a start. Be careful though, not all of those turn out to be the culprit. I've had one or two occasions where it was an adjacent cylinder in the firing order that was actually causing the problem. So be sure that you take a look at the cylinder that's mentioned, but if everything looks good, take into account it could be one of its neighbors in the firing order. You may want to move your investigation over a little bit and make sure they are okay as well. The other thing I want to make sure you do too, if you do have a DTC, make sure that you record the freeze frame data, that you take a look at that freeze frame data. Misfires are a continuous monitor. That means that they're constantly being kept an eye on. And why? Because we got to keep that catalytic converter safe, right? We got to make sure that we don't send too much raw fuel pumping into that thing that could cause a problem. So we don't want misfires to occur for that very reason. But we need to know what conditions are occurring when that misfire is happening. It's not static, is it? It could be happening in idle. It could be happening at a steady cruise. It could be happening under partial throttle under a load condition. We need to look at that freeze frame data and make sure that we have that recorded so that we can duplicate that misfire for our testing purposes and verify that we fixed it once we found the cause. Now, as my old friend G. Trulia likes to say, you don't want to wipe out freeze frame data and clear the codes right off the bat, because that's like pouring bleach on the crime scene. You won't be able to go back and check into it later on. You can check for misfire counters in enhanced data if you have that on your scan tool. Many of the OEMs now list that as a PID, and you can see which misfire or what cylinders have been counting up in their misfires or how many have been recorded in that data stream. That's one other option for you. You can check mode 6 too. In fact, nowadays I think probably every car is coming into your shop for the most part as a CAN vehicle, right? A controller area network system, and they all have it in there. I believe it starts with A2 is the test you're looking for. That's cylinder number 1. A3 is number 2. A4 is number 3. Don't tell me why they numbered it that way. It's just the way it is. And there are counters in there as part of those test results that you can look at to see if there are cylinders that have been recording up. Even if there's not a DTC, the counters are still going to show which cylinders have been recording misfires. Okay. If you're dealing with a pre-canned Ford was nice enough to put that in very early on in mode 6. In fact, right with the start of OBD2. So you can go back, I believe it's test ID number 53. Of course, you can go on to motorace.com. You can find a lot of information there that will help you use mode 6 to identify these misfiring cylinders for your diagnosis. Now, there are some other tools that are available. These are more specialized tools, and if you have a scope, you can use these not only to help you identify the misfiring cylinder, but also to help you determine what the cause is. The product on the left is the ACE misfire detector. It uses a pressure sensor called the first look to actually look at the exhaust pulses in the exhaust stream while the engine's running to help identify that weak cylinder or cylinders. And the one on the right is the Automotive Test Solutions e-misfire detector. But what I'd like to call it to your attention here, though, is that the screen here is very similar to the Ford IDS misfire detection tool that a lot of scan tools, a lot of manufacturers have also incorporated. Again, so if you have that ability, if you have the enhanced data with that available, make sure that you check that out and use that as a tool. If you don't, if you're using strictly global OBD2, then again, mode 6 for canned vehicles, it'll always be in there. Okay, once you've determined which cylinders are causing the misfire, the next thing to do is to narrow down what is the cause of the actual misfire. Now, here are the things I want you to consider when you're doing that. First, again, go back to freeze frame and consider what are the conditions that are under the engine's operating under when that misfire happened. Let me give you an example. An engine at idle takes very little fuel, doesn't it? But if it's pulling up a grade with a full load behind it, 3/4 throttle and a lot of load, then it's going to require a lot of fuel. Well, what if the fuel system isn't able to deliver the volume of fuel that's needed? Could that result in a misfire? Sure. But will that lack of volume affect it at idle? No, it won't. So looking at the conditions is already going to put a few things at the top of your list of possibilities that you need to inspect and go after. Remember, troubleshooting is all about ruling out as much as possible in the beginning of what it can't be, so that all that's left is what it can be. That's one approach. Me personally, I like to use whatever tests I can in the beginning to wipe out as many possibilities as I can in the beginning, rather than focus on any one particular pinpoint system test. But we've talked about that before. You can go back to our YouTube channel and learn more about the diagnostic process. Consider what cylinders are affected. If it's a single cylinder, that's not so hard. It's got one coil going to it, one ignition event, right? It's got one injector associated with it, and it's only got one mechanical section of the engine affected by it. So these are all things that you can home in and look at distinctly. But if there's more than one cylinders causing misfire, then you have to kind of consider what these cylinders have in common. What could cause a misfire in both those cylinders or more than one cylinder at a time? For example, if you have a DIS ignition system on the vehicle and two cylinders that share a coil happen to be the ones causing your misfire, well, I think one of the first things I'd be looking at would be that ignition coil and its circuitry, right? So that's just one thing you can do. Now, also consider, as I mentioned earlier, any factor that's going to cause less push in that cylinder can cause a misfire. So it's not limited to the ignition system. I mean, all too often, I see things online about techs that immediately go after the spark plugs, the coils. Maybe it's that term misfire. I don't know. But don't get that out of your system right off the bat. Mechanical conditions can cause a misfire. Ignition systems can cause a misfire. Fuel systems can cause a misfire. Any of these factors need to be taken into account when we're trying to determine that cause. Let's take a little closer look at all of them. For mechanical testing, one of the very first things I'd like to do in any drivability concern is do a relative compression test. And I'm not going to go into detail here. Lots of stuff on our YouTube channel about different ways you can do a relative compression test. The whole idea is to do something very quickly that gives us an idea of the health of each cylinder. If I see a weak one, well, then I'm going to focus more on that one using some of these more conventional tests like the compression or cylinder leak down test. And another way you can do it is look at the ignition waveform. If you can access the secondary and you can take a look at that, or access the primary, take a look at that. There's a lot of information in the burn line on both of those patterns. You have to be a little more expert to understand the factors that affect that pattern, and it applies not just to mechanical, but it also can provide clues to ignition or fuel-related faults as well. There's some great resources, again, like that online. And if you're thinking about attending NACE Automechanica, let me suggest that if it's not full already, you check out Jim Morton's ignition analysis class. He does a great job of presenting the elements that make up that pattern to help you learn how to use that for your diagnostics. Another tool that's at your disposal is fuel trim. Now, the first thing you're going to look at is the fuel trim recorded in the freeze frame data for the codes that you found stored in the ECM. And consider, like we said in a few trainer issues ago, it's all about keeping the catalytic converter healthy. I've got a very narrow range of feed gases that are allowed into that converter, and I've got to keep those under control. A misfire just kind of throws that all up in the air, doesn't it? Either two things are going to happen. Either way too much air is going in, or way too much fuel is going in. Way too much fuel is a bad thing, because that's definitely going to cause that catalytic converter to overheat. Let's take a look at that in a little more detail, see if we can see if you understand what I'm talking about here. Now, this is only going to work with MAF systems. It's not going to work with a speed density system that uses the MAP sensor for fuel control. So if your vehicle is equipped with a MAF sensor, mass airflow sensor, take a look at those freeze frame, stored data in the freeze frame, the fuel trim, total fuel trim that is, and consider what I'm about to tell you. Let's see if we can make sense of this. V8 engine. Cylinder number 1 has a misfire, cause as of yet unknown. But it has a mass airflow fuel control system. Now, how does this work? Well, let's just recap some of the things we've already learned. The mass airflow can physically measure the amount of air going to the engine. Does it distinguish between the left side and the right side of the engine? No, it doesn't. Does the ECM rather? Yes, it does, because it's assigned 1 as bank 1 and 1 as bank 2. So in the ECM's mind, it's dealing with 2 4-cylinder engines. Got me? So it's taking a look at the total quantity of air that came in. Total quantity of air that came in. Let's just use a round number. 100 pounds of air. And it's going to calculate how much fuel in pounds it needs to add to the engine as a whole in order to get the proper air-fuel mixture. Well, the first thing it's going to take a look at is bank 1 and bank 2, half and half. That means if I got 100 pounds going in, each bank is getting what? 50 pounds, right? 50 pounds. So now the ECM says, okay, bank 1, I need to deliver this much fuel to. And I've got 4 injectors to do that with. So that total amount of fuel added to that 50 pounds of air into bank 1, each injector is going to get enough for 12.5 pounds of air. With me so far? And that's the bank 1 total that the ECM is going to send in. And then when that combustion goes past the downstream oxygen or the upstream oxygen sensor, the ECM is going to report on how it did. With me? Bank 1, bank 2, total amount of air divided by 2, that's how much is getting into each bank. ECM makes this calculation, decides how long to pulse width the injectors to deliver the correct amount of fuel to each bank. And it gets its report when that combustion goes by the upstream O2 sensor. Okay, so let's talk about first an ignition misfire. When an ignition misfire occurs, did the air in that bank change? No. Did the amount of fuel given to that bank change? No. What happened? What did change? Well, the fuel in cylinder number 1 didn't combust. So now we have raw fuel going into the exhaust and all that unused oxygen going into the exhaust, and it's heading towards the catalytic converter. Now, that raw fuel in that converter is going to cause a lot of overheat. That's not a good thing. So one of the things that the OEM may do, or the ECM may do right off the bat, is as soon as it sees that misfire occurring and knows this is going to be a catalytic converter damaging issue, is to turn off that injector so no further fuel is being added to the problem. The mixture of that air and fuel is going through the exhaust. Some of it, because the exhaust is so hot, is going to react just as it would have if it were in the combustion chamber. But there's not going to be any contribution to power, right? Because there's no compression. It just expands in the exhaust. But a lot of it is not going to do either. It's going to go past that oxygen sensor. The oxygen sensor may see an increase in the oxygen content and may start reacting as if the fuel was lean, or there was a lean condition. And then you might start seeing some positive corrections in the fuel trim. But you're only going to see a small amount, if any, single digits. So when you're looking at that freeze frame data and you're comparing bank 1, bank 2, and you can see that bank 1 is kind of showing a few points more positive correction than bank 2, then I would tend to lean towards an ignition problem on bank 1. Okay? What if we looked at the fuel system? Okay, again, did the air change going through the system? No, that's still the same. What about the fuel? Well, the fuel did change, didn't it? Because cylinder number 1 didn't get any. If the injector totally failed and there's no fuel going into that cylinder, then cylinder 1 didn't get any fuel at all. And it's supposed to get 1/4 of the total that's going through that, or the air rather, is supposed to get all of that fuel in order to combust correctly, right? To have the right air-fuel mixture. So essentially, we shorted the air by 25%. You with me? 4 cylinders divided by 4, 100 divided by 4, 25% is what cylinder 1 represents. So again, no fuel, but now I got a whole lot of unused oxygen. None of that's going to react in the exhaust because there's nothing to react with, right? And this O2 sensor is definitely going to react to a lean condition. And I may see fuel corrections up in the 20s as a result, because I'm essentially 25% short. So that's one thing that you can look for there on the fuel trims. Again, depending on the OEM and the strategy that the ECM uses, as soon as the ECM sees that misfire, it may just go ahead and shut it all off, and you may see the same on both. It's going to make an adjustment. It's going to understand, hey, this ain't happening, go into open loop, and totally throw fuel control out the window because of that misfire. But if you can catch it on your freeze frame, just to recap, if I go into freeze frame and I know I've got a cylinder a PO301 for cylinder 1, and I can see that the fuel trims for that bank are increasing 3 to 7% more than bank 2 was running, total fuel trim, then I may think, well, maybe that's telling me it's an ignition-related event. And if I see it up in the 20s, I'm thinking fuel. Okay, does this apply across all the cases? No. This is not a 100% check this only and you'll be good to go. It's a tool, just like some of the other tips that I've showed you so far and I've shown you in past editions of the trainer. It's just one tool, one step, one other thing to look at to help you narrow down the possibility of what's causing that misfire to occur. Can you apply that to other engine designs? Certainly. This is an inline 6, of course, but as far as the ECM is concerned, isn't this the same as a V6? Aren't these divided into 2 banks? Sure. Even some 4 cylinders are divided into 2 banks. If there's an upstream oxygen sensor, a separate catalytic converter, for any given pair of cylinders, whether it's 2 out of 4, 3 out of 6, or 4 out of 8, then that's a bank, and that's going to have its own fuel control strategy. So what would happen if number 4 had no fuel? What kind of loss, or what kind of numbers would I expect to see there? Well, 1 out of 3, that's 33%. So now I may see total fuel corrections way up there. On a 4-cylinder, you're probably not going to see them anywhere near that high because that's way outside of the specs. You may just see a system lean code set along with the misfire. Here's another tool that you can use to help you diagnose the cause of a misfire, especially if it's a single-cylinder misfire. If you suspect there's a problem with an injector, a bad injector, you verified electrically it's okay, it's getting the right power, it's got good grounds, it's being pulled to ground, but maybe there's a mechanical issue with it. Well, why don't you just swap the 2? Swap that good one or that suspect one with its neighbor that you know is okay. See if the misfire moves. Again, I'm not saying just go right off to the bat, start swapping parts around. Do your other tests first. But it's a valid test. It's a valid diagnostic tool. Same with if you're dealing with a COP coil and you suspect it's a bad coil. You want to see if the misfire moves with the coil, just swap them. Cylinder, see if the misfire moves. If you've gone through the basics, and again, especially with single-cylinder misfires, and you've verified that everything related to the fuel system's okay, everything related with the ignition system's okay, and that the mechanical, the cylinder is sound, there's no problem there. Don't forget that all of these events have to occur in the right amount and at the right time. And one of the neatest ways to be able to check that now is using an in-cylinder pressure transducer to look at the mechanical condition of the engine. I can then map both the ignition event and the injector event, and I can see when they're occurring. I can see if they maintain a steady occurrence. I can look them up in the OEM service information and see when they're supposed to happen and compare them to what I'm getting actually happening on my scope. It's a very, very strong tool. And again, I'm not going to go real deep into pressure transducer diagnostics here today. Just want to make you aware of it. Lots of resources on our YouTube channel about using this tool as a diagnostic aid, and all our alternatives to making sure the ignition timing is correct, right? You can take a look at the camshaft to crankshaft patterns. If you have a known good one, that's one. We covered a lot of those topics, and I encourage you to check our YouTube channel out for additional resources. Well, that's going to do it for this edition of the Trainer. I hope that the tips and techniques that I share with you today are going to be of help to you when it comes to misfire diagnostics. And you know what? There's still time to join me at NACE Auto Mechanica in Chicago, July 26th through the 29th. A lot of the topics that you've seen me cover here in the last 6 months of the Trainer, and even beyond that, are going to be handled by some of the best trainers in the industry at this event, and it's all offered at no cost to you. Mechanical repair training, and let me stress that again, no cost to you. You just have to cover your room and board and your travel to the event at McCormick Place. You can find more information online or in the description for the video below. I'll see you next month.